13 investigates a very disturbing case involving an Indiana toddler. How this little girl died is tragic, but what happened after her death, well, some say that's downright shocking. Our senior investigative reporter Bob Siegel shows you why a judge is now at the center of the controversy. And we want to warn you, some of the images you're about to see are difficult to look at.
These pictures show Alyssa Guernsey just the way her uncle remembers her.
Cute, smiley, big smile. She loved just to cuddle up and snuggle right up with you. She was just a little cutie.
What's so hard for Tyler Sprunger to understand is how his 16-month-old niece went from this to this to this.
There's not a day that doesn't go by where Alyssa doesn't pop in my head, how she was basically, in my opinion, tortured to death.
Alyssa's short life was a turbulent one. Her father died in a car accident, her mother accused of neglect. Relatives offered to help. Christy and Matt Schaefer opened their home to a little girl in need. But it's here, in the custody of the Schaefers, that things somehow went from bad to much worse. Just a few months after going to live with her cousins, Alyssa was rushed to Parkview Hospital in LaGrange. Christy Schaefer told police she found Alyssa not breathing and unresponsive. Paramedics and doctors worked on Alyssa for more than an hour, but they could not save her. And then the investigation. Doctors found numerous bruises on the toddler's leg, face, and head. An autopsy also showed she had lacerations inside her mouth and hemorrhaging around her brain. Hair was missing from Alyssa's head, and she had a fractured arm. Christy Schaefer told police some of that could have happened when Alyssa was knocked down by the family dog. But an independent expert brought in by the coroner determined Alyssa's injuries are most consistent with inflicted trauma, such as child abuse. The coroner ruled Alyssa's death a homicide. Some expected Christy Schaefer to be charged with child abuse or manslaughter, or even murder. But the LaGrange County prosecutor didn't file charges at all. Instead, he did something he had never done in 10 years as a prosecutor. He convened a grand jury, and he let them decide whether to charge Christy Schaefer. Based on evidence presented by the prosecutor, the grand jury decided to indict Schaefer on a much lesser charge, neglect of a dependent.
Why was a grand jury called in this case? Why wasn't she just charged by you in the first place?
It was a very controversial case.
Prosecutor Jeff Weibel did not want to sit down for an interview, so I spoke with him outside his office.
It wasn't clear to me what the best charge would be, so I thought a grand jury would be the best remedy for that dilemma.
Does it make sense to call a grand jury in a case like this?
No, you would expect the prosecutor to look at the evidence and to make a decision based on the evidence the prosecutor had.
Joel Schum is a professor and legal expert at the IU School of Law.
A grand jury process is very secretive, so there's not transparency. We don't know what they were told or what they weren't told or anything else that happened in that process.
And because the process is so secretive, there's no way to know why Schaefer was indicted on a relatively minor neglect charge instead of neglect causing death.
The autopsy specifically says homicide due to blunt force trauma to the head.
You don't think this is just a neglect case?
No, the little girl was covered in bruises. Her hair, it was ripped out of her head. That comes from killing a child.
Christy Schaefer accepted a plea bargain. She pled guilty to neglect of a dependent, and at the same time, she denied doing anything to cause the child's injuries. What really happened to Alyssa that day? Well, we may never know the real answer. But more than 2 years after her death, there are more questions than ever. Disturbing questions, not just about the crime, but also about the punishment. Judge Scott Vanderbeck accepted Schaefer's plea. He could have sentenced her to 20 years in prison. But Schaefer had no criminal history, and her court file was stuffed with more than 100 letters from family and friends asking the judge for mercy. The judge sentenced Schaefer to just 4 years behind bars. And at the same time, he extended an unusual invitation. He told Schaefer to come back in a couple of months to have her sentence reduced even further.
Very rarely does a judge encourage a defense lawyer to file a motion and ask for a modification. So that's certainly surprising.
Even more surprising, when Schaefer came back to court, the judge did not just reduce her sentence, he set her free. The woman who pled guilty to neglecting Alyssa Guernsey served just 77 days behind bars.
You argued against that.
Absolutely. I was against the modification. I did not think it was warranted. 77 days wasn't enough.
Alissa's uncle agreed. He organized protests around the county courthouse to let others know what had happened.
She only got it for neglect, not abuse or murder. That's wrong.
I feel it's small town politics at its best.
What do you mean by that?
Somebody knew somebody that knew somebody that, had been involved in the community. The links and the connections are there.
What kind of connections? Well, around the courthouse, it seems a lot of people know Christy Schaefer's family.
Are you friends with the family? Do you know the father?
I know Christy Schaefer's father. He's a banker here in town, and I've spoken with him on occasion, but he's never been a client of mine, and I've never done any work for him.
The judge knows him too. Carrie Sprunger is the senior vice president and senior loan officer of the biggest bank in LaGrange. 13 Investigates obtained a court transcript where Judge Vanderbeck admits, I know Mr. Sprunger. He's been on some boards with me. I know he's got a good heart. And I think I went to a baseball game with his son. So I wouldn't do that if they were bad people. I asked the judge about his relationship with the defendant's family. He told me he cannot discuss the case at all because of ethical rules for judges. But both the judge and the prosecutor deny any conflict of interest. Still, questions remain.
There's just too many shady things in this case.
The process is, from the beginning to the end, a very unusual case.
Perhaps the biggest question, was justice truly served for a little girl who died of a homicide?
Somebody has to stick up for her because nobody did. You cannot take a life and not have to pay for it.
After our meeting with the judge, he decided to step down from the case. Critics say that's what should have happened from the very beginning, and they now want the case against Christy Schaefer reopened, if nothing else, to help determine what really happened to Alissa. Legal experts say that's unlikely to happen. In the meantime, Schaefer is out on parole and living at home. We visited the Schaefer family to get their side of the story. They chose not to comment. I'm Bob Siegel, Channel 13 Eyewitness News.